Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the depths of the past in the most soothing way possible. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a gentle journey through one of history's most complex and lengthy series of conflicts, the Crusades. Over the next few hours, we'll travel from the dusty roads of 11th century Europe to the ancient walls of Jerusalem, from the courts of popes and kings to the camps of knights and soldiers. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander through the centuries as we explore this fascinating period of medieval history. Whether you're here to learn or simply to drift off to sleep, know that you are in the right place. If you enjoy this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you may think. Chapter 1. The World Before the Crusades. To understand the Crusades, we must first understand the world that gave birth to them. Picture, if you will, the year 1095. Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, each with its own ruler, its own laws, its own way of life. The concept of nations as we know them today did not exist. Instead, loyalty was personal, flowing from vassal to lord, from lord to king, and from king to emperor or pope. The Catholic Church stood as the one unifying force across this fragmented landscape. In an age where most people never travelled more than 10 miles from their birthplace, the Church provided a common language in Latin, common rituals in the Mass, and a common spiritual authority in the person of the Pope in Rome. The Pope was not merely a religious figure, but a political power, commanding armies, negotiating treaties, and crowning emperors. In the year 1054, the Christian Church had experienced a great schism, splitting into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic branches. This division would play a crucial role in the events to come. The Eastern Church, centered in Constantinople, now Istanbul, had developed its own traditions, its own hierarchy, and its own relationship with political power. The Byzantine Empire, as the Eastern Roman Empire was known, stretched across modern-day Turkey, Greece, and parts of the Balkans. It was wealthy, sophisticated, and ancient, seeing itself as the true heir to Roman civilization. Meanwhile, to the south and east, another great religious and political force had been growing for over 4 centuries. Islam, founded by the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, had spread with remarkable speed across the Arabian Peninsula, through North Africa, into Spain, and across the Middle East. By the 11th century, Islamic civilization was in many ways more advanced than Christian Europe. Its cities were larger, its scholarship more sophisticated, its trade networks more extensive. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were centers of learning where mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy flourished. The Islamic world, however, was not monolithic. It was divided between Sunni and Shia branches, between different caliphates and sultanates, each vying for power and legitimacy. In the 11th century, a new power was rising. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from Central Asia who had converted to Sunni Islam. The Seljuks had begun conquering territories from the older Islamic dynasties and from the Byzantine Empire. In the year 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuks defeated the Byzantine army and captured the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV. This battle opened Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, to Turkish settlement and control. Jerusalem, the holy city sacred to Judaism, Christianity and Islam had been under Muslim control since the 7th century, changing hands between different Islamic dynasties. For centuries, Christian pilgrims from Europe had been able to visit Jerusalem and other holy sites with relative ease, paying taxes to local Muslim authorities, but generally unmolested. However, the rise of the Seljuks brought increased instability to the region. Life in 11th century Europe was, for most people, short, brutal, and bound to the land. The feudal system dominated society. At the top were the kings and great nobles, owners of vast estates. Below them were the knights and lesser nobles, who held land in exchange for military service. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land and could not leave without their lord's permission. Most people were illiterate. Disease was rampant. Famine was common. The average life expectancy was perhaps 30 to 35 years. Yet this was also an age of faith. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The church calendar structured the year with its saints' days and holy seasons. People believed in a world filled with miracles, angels, demons, and divine intervention. Heaven and hell were not abstract concepts, but real places, and one's actions on earth determined one's eternal fate. The church taught that certain actions could reduce one's time in purgatory, that transitional state between death and heaven. Pilgrimage to holy sites was one such action, as was fighting in defense of the faith. Knights, the warrior class of medieval society, were a relatively new phenomenon in the 11th century. They had emerged from the chaos of the 9th and 10th centuries, when Vikings, Magyars and Muslims had raided Christian Europe. Mounted warriors in armour became essential for defence. But these warriors were also a problem. In an age of weak central authority, knights often fought each other, pillaging and destroying in local conflicts. The church had tried to channel this violence through movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which declared certain days and certain people off limits for fighting. But the problem persisted. Into this world came Pope Urban II. He was born Odo of Lagarie around the year 1035 in France. He had been a monk at Cluny, the great reformed monastery, before rising through the church hierarchy. He became pope in 1088, but his authority was contested. Another man, Clement III, claims to be the true pope and had the support of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. This was part of the investiture controversy, a long-running conflict over whether secular rulers or the Pope had the right to appoint bishops and other church officials. Urban needed to strengthen his position, to demonstrate the power and relevance of the papacy. An opportunity arose from the east. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, was facing pressure from the Seljuk Turks and had sent appeals to the west for military aid. This was remarkable given the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, but Alexios was desperate. He hoped for a few thousand soldiers to serve as mercenaries. What Urban envisioned was something far grander. He saw an opportunity to unite Western Christianity under papal authority, to channel the violence of the knightly class toward a holy purpose, and perhaps to heal the schism with the Eastern Church. He would call for an armed pilgrimage to free Jerusalem and the holy places from Muslim control. Chapter 2. The Council of Clermont and the People's Crusade. In November of the year 1095, Pope Urban II travelled to Clermont, a town in the Auvergne region of central France. He called a church council, a gathering of bishops, abbots, and other church officials. Hundreds attended. The council addressed various church matters, but its most important moment came on November 27th, when Urban delivered a speech in an open field outside the town. We do not have an exact transcript of Urban's speech. Medieval chroniclers, writing years later, gave various accounts, each shaped by their own perspectives and purposes. But the core message was clear and powerful. Urban spoke of the plight of Christians in the East, of pilgrims harassed and holy places desecrated. He called upon the warriors of Western Christendom to take up arms and march to Jerusalem. He offered spiritual rewards. Those who undertook this journey with pure hearts would receive remission of their sins. For a society deeply concerned with salvation, this was an extraordinary offer. Urban framed this as both a defensive war and a pilgrimage. The Muslims, he said, had taken lands that rightfully belonged to Christians. To free these lands was an act of justice. But more than that, it was an act of devotion. Jerusalem was where Christ had died and risen. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre marked the site of his tomb. What could be more pleasing to God than liberating these sacred places? The response was immediate and overwhelming, far beyond what Urban had anticipated. Those who pledged to go began sewing cloth crosses onto their garments, giving birth to the term crusade from the Latin word for cross. The cry Deus vult, meaning God wills it, became the rallying cry. Urban had envisioned an organized military expedition led by nobles and composed of trained knights. What happened instead was more chaotic. Before the official departure date set for August of 1096, a wave of popular enthusiasm swept through France and Germany. Preachers, some authorized by the church and some not, traveled from town to town, calling people to the holy cause. The most famous of these preachers was Peter the Hermit, an ascetic monk who claimed to have received a vision from Christ commanding him to preach the crusade. Peter was a powerful speaker, able to move crowds to tears and action. He gathered a following of thousands, mostly poor people, peasants, artisans, even women and children. These were not trained warriors, but common folk, motivated by faith, by the promise of salvation, and perhaps by the hope of a better life in the East. This movement became known as the People's Crusade or the Peasants' Crusade. It departed in the spring of 1096, months before the official crusading armies. Peter the Hermit led one group. Another was led by a minor French knight, remembered in history as Walter sans avoir, meaning Walter the Penniless. There were other groups as well, each following charismatic leaders. The journey was disastrous from the start. These were poor people, ill-equipped and lacking organization. As they traveled through Germany and Hungary, they relied on local populations for food. When supplies were not forthcoming, they took what they needed, leading to conflicts with the very Christian communities they passed through. In Hungary, a dispute over the cost of supplies led to violence. The Hungarian king's forces attacked and killed several thousand crusaders. But an even darker aspect of the People's Crusade emerged before the main groups even left Western Europe. Some crusaders, whipped up by anti-Jewish preaching, asked why they should march thousands of miles to fight non-Christians in the East when there were non-Christians, specifically Jews, living in their own lands. In the Rhineland, in cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz and Cologne, Crusader bands attacked Jewish communities. Despite efforts by some local bishops and nobles to protect the Jews, thousands were killed. Jews were given the choice of conversion or death. Many chose death rather than abandon their faith. Some communities committed collective suicide rather than face baptism or massacre. These events, known as the Rhineland massacres, were among the worst anti-Jewish pogroms in medieval history up to that point. They set a terrible precedent that would be repeated in later crusades. The main groups of the People's Crusade eventually reached Constantinople in the summer of 1096. Emperor Alexios was alarmed. He had asked for professional soldiers, mercenaries he could command. Instead, he received a disorganized mob of perhaps 20,000 people. He quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, wanting them away from his capital. Once in Turkish-held territory, the Crusaders' lack of discipline became fatal. Against Peter, the hermit's advice, they split into factions. One group, composed of Germans, went off on its own, raiding and pillaging. The Turks ambushed and destroyed them. The main force, encamped near the city of Nicaea, was then attacked by a large Turkish army. The untrained, ill-equipped Crusaders were slaughtered. Only a few thousand escaped back to Constantinople. Peter the Hermit, ironically, had been away from the camp when the attack occurred, having gone back to Constantinople to seek supplies. He survived and would later accompany the main crusading armies. The People's Crusade was a complete failure, a tragedy born of religious enthusiasm, untempered by practical planning. But the official crusade, the Prince's Crusade as it came to be known, was yet to come. Chapter 3. The First Crusade begins. While the People's Crusade met its doom in Asia Minor, the armies of the official First Crusade were gathering. These were not royal armies. No king participated in the First Crusade. Instead, they were forces led by great nobles and princes, each commanding his own contingent of knights, soldiers, and followers. From southern France came Raymond of Saint-Gilles, the Count of Toulouse. Raymond was already in his mid-50s, an old man by medieval standards. He was deeply pious and took his crusading vow seriously. He was accompanied by the papal legate, Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, who was meant to provide spiritual guidance and represent the Pope's authority. From Lorraine in eastern France came Duke Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin of Boulogne. Godfrey was a tall, strong warrior, famous for his piety and military skill. Baldwin was more ambitious and practical, less interested in spiritual rewards than in worldly gain. From Normandy in northern France came Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy and eldest son of William the Conqueror. With him came his brother-in-law, Stephen of Blois, a wealthy count who would later become infamous for his actions during the Crusade. From southern Italy came two Norman leaders, Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred. Bohemond was the son of Robert Guiscard, a Norman adventurer who had carved out a kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. Bohemond was ambitious, calculating, and an excellent military commander. His participation in the crusade was motivated as much by desire for power and land as by religious devotion. Each of these leaders commanded between 1,000 and 3,000 knights, along with infantry and non-combatants. In total, the First Crusade probably consisted of around 30,000 to 40,000 fighting men, plus many more camp followers, pilgrims, and servants. This was an enormous force by 11th century standards. The different contingents took different routes to Constantinople, but all arrived between late 1096 and spring of 1097. Emperor Alexios found himself in a delicate position. He needed these warriors to help regain lost Byzantine territory, but he also feared them. These were powerful, independent leaders commanding large armies, now gathered near his capital. Moreover, there was significant cultural misunderstanding between the Byzantines and the Western Europeans. The Byzantines, heirs to Roman imperial tradition, saw themselves as sophisticated and civilized. They viewed the Crusaders as crude barbarians. The Crusaders, for their part, were suspicious of Byzantine wealth and diplomacy, which they saw as effeminate and deceitful. Alexios required each crusading leader to swear an oath of fealty to him and to agree that any lands reconquered from the Muslims that had previously belonged to Byzantium would be returned to imperial control. Most of the leaders took this oath, though some, like Bohemond, clearly had reservations. Raymond of Toulouse, protective of his independence, initially refused, but eventually swore a modified oath. In the spring of 1097, the crusading armies crossed into Asia Minor. Their first target was Nicaea, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, located near Constantinople. The Crusaders laid siege to the city, but before they could take it by assault, the Byzantine navy arrived on the lake beside the city and cut off its water supply. The city's Turkish garrison negotiated a surrender to the Byzantines, not the Crusaders. The Crusaders were furious, having hoped to loot the wealthy city. This early incident deepened the distrust between the Western and Byzantine Christians. From Nicaea, the crusading army marched southeast across Anatolia towards Syria. On July 1st, 1097, near Dorylaeum, they were attacked by a large force of Seljuk Turks, led by the Sultan Kilij Arslan. The battle was desperate. The Turkish cavalry, armed with composite bows, rode circles around the crusading army, raining arrows down. The Crusaders, in their heavy armour and on their slower horses, struggled to respond. But they held formation, and when reinforcements arrived from the rear guard, they launched a combined cavalry charge that broke the Turkish line. The Turks fled, leaving behind their camp and supplies. The victory at Dorylaeum opened the way for the Crusaders to advance deeper into Muslim-held territory. But the march was grueling. They crossed the barren Anatolian plateau in the height of summer. Water was scarce. Horses and pack animals died by the hundreds. Men collapsed from heat and thirst. Yet the army pressed on, driven by faith, by the dream of Jerusalem, and by the momentum of their journey. They reached the Armenian-inhabited highlands of southern Anatolia in the autumn. Here, the Christian Armenian population, long suffering under Turkish rule, welcomed the Crusaders as liberators. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, saw an opportunity. With a small force, he left the main army and headed east into Cilicia, claiming towns and fortresses. Local Armenian leaders, desperate for protection against the Turks, invited Baldwin to become their ruler. In this way, Baldwin established the county of Edessa, the first of the Crusader States. It was a clear indication that not all Crusaders were motivated purely by the desire to reach Jerusalem. Territorial ambition played a major role. The main army continued south, reaching the great city of Antioch in October of 1097. Antioch was one of the oldest and most important cities in Christian history. It was here that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. The city had massive walls, considered nearly impregnable. It was held by a Turkish governor, Yagisiyan, with a garrison of perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers. Chapter 4: The Siege of Antioch. The siege of Antioch would last from October of 1097 to June of 1098, a period of 8 months that tested the Crusaders to their limits. The city's walls were immense, stretching for miles, and studded with hundreds of towers. The Crusaders did not have enough men to completely surround the city, so they established camps at key points, attempting to cut off supplies. As winter set in, conditions became dire. Food ran short. Foraging parties had to range farther and farther from the camps, making them vulnerable to Turkish attacks. Horses died in large numbers, weakening the crusading army's cavalry, its greatest military asset. Some crusaders began to desert, slipping away in the night. Even great nobles left. Peter the Hermit tried to flee, but was caught and brought back. Most notoriously, Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthy and prominent leaders, left the siege claiming illness. He would return to Europe and face shame and ridicule, eventually returning to the Holy Land on a later crusade to redeem himself. Within Antioch, the situation was also growing desperate. The city was crowded with refugees who had fled there ahead of the crusading army. Food supplies dwindled. Governor Yagisiyan sent urgent appeals for help to nearby Muslim rulers. In February of 1098, a relief force of Turkish and Arab soldiers approached Antioch from the east. The Crusaders met them in battle near the shores of a lake and won a significant victory, capturing supplies and demonstrating that, despite their hardships, they remained a formidable fighting force. But the real turning point came through betrayal. An Armenian guard named Firuz, responsible for several of Antioch's towers, was approached by Bohemond. The exact circumstances vary in different accounts. Firuz may have been motivated by bribery, by fear, or by religious sympathy for the Christians. Whatever the reason, he agreed to let the Crusaders into the city. Before acting on this opportunity, Bohemond insisted on a condition. The other crusading leaders must agree that whoever took Antioch would keep it. This was controversial, especially to Raymond of Toulouse, who felt bound by his oath to return former Byzantine lands to Alexios. But the situation was desperate, and Bohemond's plan offered the only realistic hope of taking the city. The leaders reluctantly agreed. On the night of June 2nd to 3rd, 1098, a select group of crusaders, led by Bohemond, climbed rope ladders to the towers controlled by Firuz. They killed the guards silently, opened the gates, and the crusading army flooded into Antioch. The city fell quickly. Governor Yagisiyan fled and was killed. The Christian population of Antioch, which had been living under Muslim rule, welcomed the Crusaders. Much of the Muslim population was killed in the chaotic aftermath of the city's fall, but the Crusaders' triumph was short-lived. Just 3 days after they took Antioch, a massive Muslim relief army arrived outside the city. This force was led by Kaboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, a powerful Turkish military commander. Kaboga had gathered a coalition of Muslim forces from across the region, perhaps numbering 30,000 to 40,000 men. They now laid siege to Antioch. trapping the Crusaders inside the very city they had just captured. The situation seemed hopeless. The Crusaders were exhausted from the long siege. Food was again scarce. Disease spread through the overcrowded city. Some Crusaders, losing hope, deserted by climbing down the walls on ropes and fleeing. Alexios, who had been marching toward Antioch with a Byzantine army to support the Crusaders, heard reports of the hopeless situation and turned back, abandoning the expedition. When the Crusaders later learned of this, it deepened their resentment of the Byzantines and justified, in their eyes, breaking their oath to return Antioch to imperial control. In the midst of despair, something remarkable happened. A poor pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions of Saint Andrew, who revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. Following Peter's directions, men excavated beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral and discovered an ancient spearhead. Whether this was genuinely an ancient relic, whether it was the actual Holy Lance, or whether it was planted by those seeking to boost morale, remains debated. But the effect on the Crusaders was electric. Their spirits revived. This was seen as a sign of divine favour. On June 28, 1098, the crusading leaders decided on a desperate gambit. They would leave the city and fight Kerboga's army in open battle. It seemed like suicide, but they believed God was on their side. Priests carried the Holy Lance before the army. Barefoot and chanting hymns, the Crusaders marched out through the gates. Kerboga's army vastly outnumbered the Crusaders, but Kerboga made fatal mistakes. He allowed his forces to spread out, perhaps intending to encircle the Crusaders. Before he could complete this maneuver, the Crusaders charged. The battle was fierce, but the Muslim forces, composed of different factions with competing interests, lacked cohesion. When one part of the line began to retreat, the panic spread. Kerboga's army broke and fled. The Crusaders won a stunning, improbable victory. With this victory, the Crusaders secured Antioch. Bohemond claimed the city as his principality despite objections from Raymond and despite the oath to return it to Byzantium. The Principality of Antioch would become one of the lasting Crusader states, surviving for nearly 2 centuries. But the Crusades' ultimate goal was still Jerusalem, hundreds of miles to the south. The leaders debated for months about what to do next. Many Crusaders wanted to continue immediately, but the leaders, exhausted and preoccupied with securing their gains, hesitated. Not until January of 1099 did they finally resume the march toward the Holy City. Chapter 5. The Capture of Jerusalem. The crusading army that marched toward Jerusalem in early 1099 was smaller than the force that had arrived in the east 2 years earlier. Many knights and soldiers had died in battle from disease or from starvation. Others had settled in the territories already captured, particularly in Antioch and Edessa. Perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 fighting men continued toward Jerusalem, along with a larger number of pilgrims and non-combatants. They travelled down the coast of the Levant, through modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Many coastal cities, controlled by local Muslim emirs or autonomous governors, chose not to resist, either making treaties with the Crusaders or simply staying behind their walls. The Crusaders were not interested in conquering every city. Their focus was Jerusalem. At that time, Jerusalem was controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate based in Egypt. The Fatimids were Shia Muslims, rivals of the Sunni Seljuk Turks. In fact, the Fatimids had recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks just the year before, in 1098. The Fatimid governor of Jerusalem, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, prepared the city's defences. He expelled the Christian inhabitants, fearing they might aid the Crusaders. He poisoned wells outside the city and stockpiled food and weapons. The crusading army arrived outside Jerusalem on June 7th, 1099. The sight of the city, the goal of their long journey, filled the Crusaders with emotion. Many wept, prayed, and gave thanks to God, but they faced a formidable challenge. Jerusalem's walls were strong, well maintained, and well defended. The Crusaders lacked siege equipment and faced the same problem they had at Antioch: insufficient numbers to surround the city completely. Moreover, it was summer, and the surrounding countryside offered little water or food. The nearest water source, the pool of Siloam, was outside the walls and controlled by the defenders. The Crusaders had to travel miles to find water. Conditions were harsh. Help came from an unexpected source. On June 17th, a Genoese fleet arrived at the port of Jaffa, about 35 miles from Jerusalem. The Genoese sailors brought supplies, tools, and, most importantly, the materials needed to construct siege equipment. The Crusaders dismantled the ships and hauled the timber overland to Jerusalem, where skilled craftsmen set to work building siege towers, battering rams, and catapults. While preparations continued, a procession took place. On July 8th, led by priests and bishops, the Crusaders walked barefoot around the city walls, chanting hymns and prayers. This was modelled on the biblical story of Jericho, where the Israelites marched around the city before its walls fell. The Muslim defenders watched and mocked from the walls, but for the Crusaders this was a sacred ritual, a way of sanctifying their cause. The assault began on July 13th, 1099. The Crusaders attacked from multiple directions, using their siege towers to approach the walls, while battering rams pounded the gates and catapults hurled stones. The defenders fought desperately, using Greek fire, a Byzantine incendiary weapon, to set the siege towers ablaze. They dropped stones and boiling oil on the attackers. The first day's assault failed. But on July 15th, the Crusaders renewed their attack with greater determination. 2 siege towers, one commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon and another by Raymond of Toulouse, were rolled up against the walls. Godfrey's tower reached the northern wall around midday. Knights used a wooden bridge to cross from the tower onto the wall, overwhelming the defenders. Once they controlled a section of wall, they opened a gate, and the crusading army poured into the city. What followed was a massacre. The Crusaders, filled with battle fury, religious zeal, and perhaps motivated by revenge for the hardships they had endured, killed indiscriminately. Muslims, Jews, even some Eastern Christians were cut down. The Jewish community had taken refuge in their main synagogue. The Crusaders barricaded the doors and set the building ablaze, burning everyone inside alive. Contemporary accounts, written by Crusaders themselves, describe streets running with blood and piles of severed heads, hands, and feet. The killing continued for days. Modern historians estimate that between 3,000 and 10,000 people were killed in the immediate aftermath of the city's capture, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. The Crusaders saw this as divine justice, as the cleansing of the holy city. They went weeping to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, to pray and give thanks, stepping over corpses to reach it. To them, the success of the crusade proved that God had been with them all along. With Jerusalem secured, the crusading leaders faced the question of what came next. They needed to establish a government to rule the conquered city and its surrounding territory. After some debate, Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as the ruler. Godfrey, displaying characteristic piety, refused the title of king, saying he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he took the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, or Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. When Godfrey died just a year later, in 1100, his brother Baldwin, who was called back from Edessa, succeeded him and did take the title King of Jerusalem. Many crusaders, having fulfilled their vows to reach Jerusalem and pray at the holy sites, now wanted to return home. The majority did. By late 1099, most of the crusading army had departed. Only a few hundred knights remained to defend the newly established kingdom of Jerusalem. This would be a recurring problem for the Crusader States, a chronic shortage of manpower. In August of 1099, a Fatimid army from Egypt marched north to retake Jerusalem. The Crusaders, despite being heavily outnumbered, met them at the Battle of Ascalon and won a decisive victory, securing their hold on the region. But it was clear that the Crusader states would face constant military pressure from their Muslim neighbours. Chapter 6: The Crusader States. The success of the First Crusade led to the establishment of 4 Crusader states in the Levant: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These were not unified under a single ruler, but were separate polities, though they often cooperated in military matters. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the most prestigious, its king considered first among equals among the Crusader rulers. At its greatest extent, it controlled a narrow strip of territory along the eastern Mediterranean coast, from modern-day southern Turkey down through Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine. Inland, Crusader control was limited, focused on fortified castles and key towns. The population of the Crusader states was diverse and complex. The Frankish Crusaders, as the Muslims called all Western Europeans, formed a small ruling elite. They established a feudal system similar to that in Europe, with fiefs granted to knights who owed military service. Below the Frankish nobility were various Christian communities: Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syrian Orthodox, Maronites, and others. These Eastern Christians had lived in the region for centuries and greatly outnumbered the Frankish settlers. Their relationship with the Frankish rulers was often tense. The Franks were Catholic and viewed the Eastern Christians' different rites and traditions with suspicion. The Eastern Christians, for their part, resented Frankish dominance and heavy-handedness. Then there were the Muslims and Jews who remained in Crusader-controlled territory. In the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade, many had been killed or fled, but over time, Muslim communities re-established themselves, especially in rural areas. They lived as subjects of the Crusader states, paying taxes and living under restrictions, but generally tolerated as long as they posed no threat. The economy of the Crusader states was based largely on agriculture and trade. The Levantine coast was a crossroads of trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Italian city-states, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, established trading colonies in Crusader ports, exchanging European goods for Eastern spices, silk, and other luxuries. These Italian merchants provided crucial naval support to the Crusader States and in return received trade concessions and autonomy in their quarters. Militarily, the Crusader States faced an existential problem. They lacked sufficient troops to defend their extensive territories and to conduct offensive operations. The Muslim world surrounding them was vastly larger in population and resources. To address this, the Crusader States relied on several strategies. They built extensive networks of castles and fortifications, leveraging defensive architecture to compensate for lack of numbers. Some of these castles, like Crac des Chevaliers, were massive and could withstand long sieges. The Crusader States also depended on military orders, organizations of warrior monks who combined religious devotion with military service. The two most famous were the Knights Templar, founded around 1119, and the Knights Hospitaller, which had existed as a charitable order before becoming militarized around 1120. These orders attracted recruits from Europe who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and dedicated their lives to defending the Holy Land. The military orders became the backbone of the Crusader States' defense, maintaining garrisons in key castles and providing a corps of professional permanent soldiers. Despite these measures, the Crusader States remained vulnerable, and their very existence provoked a Muslim response that would grow in strength and coordination over time. Chapter 7: The Muslim Response and the Fall of Edessa. In the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade, the Muslim world was disunited. The various emirs, atabegs, and sultans who ruled different parts of Syria, Iraq, and Egypt were more concerned with fighting each other than with reclaiming the territories lost to the Crusaders. This disunity was one reason the Crusader States survived their first few decades. However, the concept of jihad, or holy war, began to be invoked more frequently. Jihad had multiple meanings in Islamic theology, including internal spiritual struggle, but it also meant armed struggle in defense of Islam. Muslim scholars and leaders began calling for jihad against the Crusaders, framing the conflict as a religious duty. The first major Muslim leader to take up this cause systematically was Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. Zengi was a formidable military commander and a ruthless politician. He worked to consolidate Muslim territories in Syria and northern Mesopotamia, bringing rival Muslim factions under his control. In 1144, Zengi besieged the county of Edessa, the most vulnerable of the Crusader states, due to its isolation from the other Crusader territories and its small Frankish population. On Christmas Eve, 1144, Edessa fell. The city's Frankish defenders and population were killed or enslaved. The county of Edessa, the first Crusader state established, was now lost. News of Edessa's fall shocked Christian Europe. It demonstrated that the Crusader states were not secure, that Muslim forces were regrouping and counterattacking. Pope Eugenius III called for a new crusade, the Second Crusade, to reclaim Edessa and strengthen the remaining Crusader states. Chapter 8: The Second Crusade. The Second Crusade launched in 1147, was the first crusade to be led by kings. King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany both took the cross and led their armies east. The involvement of kings gave the crusade great prestige, but it also introduced political complications. The preaching of the Second Crusade was led by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the 12th century. Bernard was a Cistercian abbot, a charismatic preacher, and a mystic. His sermons on the crusade attracted thousands. He travelled through France and Germany, calling upon Christians to take up the cross. His rhetoric was powerful and emotional, emphasizing the urgency of the cause and the spiritual rewards of participation. However, Bernard's preaching also had a dark side. Another preacher, a Cistercian monk named Radolf, travelled through the Rhineland, calling for attacks on Jews, echoing the terrible events of the First Crusade. Bernard himself intervened, travelling to Germany to preach against such violence, arguing that Jews should not be harmed. His intervention likely saved lives, but attacks on Jewish communities still occurred, particularly in the French town of Carentan and in areas where Bernard's message did not reach. The German army, led by Conrad III, departed first, marching overland through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire. Relations with the Byzantines were already strained from the First Crusade, and they worsened during the Second. The Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, distrusted the Crusaders and feared that such a large foreign army passing through his territory posed a threat. There were incidents of violence and looting. Manuel had also made a truce with the Seljuk Turks, which the Crusaders viewed as a betrayal. When the German army entered Anatolia, they were ambushed and heavily defeated by Turkish forces at the Battle of Dorylaeum, the same site where the First Crusade had won a victory 50 years earlier. Conrad lost most of his army and retreated back to the Byzantine coast. The French army, following behind, fared somewhat better, but also suffered heavy losses from Turkish attacks and from harsh conditions crossing Anatolia. Louis and Conrad eventually reached Antioch in 1148, where they were received by Prince Raymond of Antioch, who was coincidentally Louis's uncle by marriage. Raymond wanted the crusading armies to attack Aleppo, the power centre of Zengi's successor, Nur ad-Din. This made strategic sense, as Aleppo posed a direct threat to Antioch. But Louis was uncomfortable with Raymond's proposal, partly because of political tensions, and partly because of rumours, likely unfounded, that Raymond was having an affair with Louis's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Instead, Louis decided to continue to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, the crusading leaders held a council to decide their target. Rather than attacking Aleppo or attempting to reclaim Edessa, they decided to besiege Damascus. This decision was strategically foolish. Damascus was a wealthy, powerful city, but its ruler was actually relatively friendly toward the Crusader States and was a counterweight to the more aggressive Nur ad-Din. Attacking Damascus would only drive its ruler into Nur ad-Din's arms. The siege of Damascus began in July of 1148. It was a disaster. The Crusaders encamped in orchards outside the city's walls, but they quickly realized they could not maintain their position. The Damascene defenders fought fiercely, and word arrived that Nur ad-Din was marching to Damascus's relief with a large army. After just 4 days, the Crusaders abandoned the siege and retreated. The Second Crusade ended in humiliating failure. The consequences were profound. The prestige of crusading was damaged. Thousands had died for no gain. Damascus, which had been neutral or even friendly, now allied with Nur ad-Din. And in Europe, there was growing skepticism about the crusading enterprise. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had promised that God would grant victory, was deeply troubled by the failure and struggled to explain it. Chapter 9. Saladin and the Battle of Hattin. In the decades following the Second Crusade, the balance of power in the Levant gradually shifted against the Crusader States. The key figure in this shift was a Kurdish military commander named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin was born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit in modern-day Iraq. His family served Zengi and his son Nur ad-Din. Saladin's uncle, Shirkuh, was a prominent military commander, and Saladin accompanied him on campaigns. In 1169, Shirkuh became the vizier or chief minister of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. When Shirkuh died shortly after, Saladin succeeded him as vizier. The Fatimid Caliphate was in decline, weakened by internal strife and external threats. Saladin, nominally serving the Fatimid Caliph, actually held the real power. In 1171, the Fatimid Caliph died, and Saladin abolished the Fatimid dynasty, bringing Egypt under the nominal authority of the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. In reality, Saladin ruled Egypt independently as Sultan. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved to take control of his territories in Syria as well, claiming to be acting in the interests of Nur ad-Din's young son. Through a combination of military campaigns and diplomacy, Saladin gradually brought Damascus, Aleppo, and other Syrian cities under his control. By the early 1180s, Saladin controlled Egypt, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia, encircling the Crusader States. Saladin was a complex figure. He was a skilled military commander, a shrewd politician, and a devout Muslim who took seriously the call to jihad. He was also known for his chivalry and mercy, especially by the standards of the time. He treated prisoners and defeated enemies with respect, which earned him admiration even from his Christian foes. Medieval European chroniclers often portrayed Saladin in a positive light, sometimes more so than they portrayed their own leaders. In the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, politics were becoming increasingly dysfunctional. King Amalric I had died in 1174, succeeded by his son Baldwin IV. Baldwin was a remarkable young man, intelligent and brave, but he suffered from leprosy. The disease gradually incapacitated him, and much of his reign was spent managing rival factions among the nobility. One particularly aggressive faction was led by Reynaud of Châtillon, a French knight who had married into the nobility of the Crusader States. Reynaud was a brutal, reckless figure who delighted in antagonizing the Muslims. He raided Muslim trade caravans, even those travelling under truce. In 1187, Reynaud attacked a large caravan travelling from Cairo to Damascus, seizing its goods and taking prisoners, including some of Saladin's relatives. This blatant violation of a truce gave Saladin a justification for war. Saladin assembled a massive army, perhaps 30,000 strong, and invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the summer of 1187. The Crusader leaders, despite internal disagreements, mustered their forces to respond. They gathered an army of about 20,000 men, including virtually every able-bodied knight in the kingdom, along with the military orders and mercenaries. The two armies maneuvered in the hills of Galilee. Saladin, a patient and strategic commander, avoided a direct assault on the Crusader army and instead tried to lure them into a disadvantageous position. He besieged the city of Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The city was held by the Countess of Tripoli, wife of one of the Crusader leaders, Count Raymond of Tripoli. Raymond, despite his personal stake, advised against marching to relieve Tiberias. He argued that Saladin was trying to lure them away from water sources and into the open, where the larger Muslim army could surround them. But other leaders, including Reynold and King Guy of Jerusalem, who was Baldwin's successor, argued for action, accusing Raymond of cowardice. On July 3rd, 1187, the Crusader army began a march toward Tiberias. It was brutally hot. The route took them away from springs and wells. Saladin's forces harassed them constantly, skirmishing and then retreating, preventing them from resting or refilling water supplies. By evening, the Crusaders, parched and exhausted, camped on a plateau near a double-peaked hill called the Horns of Hattin. That night, Saladin's army surrounded them. Muslim soldiers set fire to the dry grass, filling the air with smoke and adding to the Crusaders' misery. Dawn on July 4th, 1187, brought the final battle. The Crusaders, desperately thirsty and demoralized, attempted to break through to the water of the Sea of Galilee, visible in the distance. But Saladin's forces pressed in from all sides. The Crusader infantry, mostly made up of common soldiers, broke and fled toward the Horns of Hattin, where they were surrounded and forced to surrender. The knights, the core of the Crusader army, fought on but were gradually overwhelmed. By midday, the battle was over. King Guy, the Grand Master of the Templars, and many other nobles were captured. Reynold of Chatillon was among the prisoners. Saladin personally executed Reynold, reportedly striking him with a sword in his tent, an act of vengeance for Reynold's provocations. The other nobles were treated with courtesy and held for ransom, but the common soldiers and the members of the military orders who were captured met different fates. Saladin offered the Templars and Hospitallers the choice of conversion to Islam or death. Almost all chose death, and they were executed. The Battle of Hattin was one of the most decisive battles of the Crusades. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had lost its army. Virtually every able-bodied knight and soldier had been killed or captured. The kingdom lay defenseless. Chapter 10. The Fall of Jerusalem and the Third Crusade. In the months following Hattin, Saladin's armies swept through the Crusader States. Cities and castles fell one after another. Many surrendered without a fight, knowing resistance was futile. By September of 1187, Saladin stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The defense of Jerusalem was organized by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few nobles who had escaped capture at Hattin. He had traveled to Jerusalem to evacuate his wife and children, but found himself pressured to stay and lead the defense. The garrison was small, cobbled together from refugees and men knighted on the spot to bolster morale. Thousands of refugees crowded into the city, far more than it could support. Saladin offered terms. He would allow the inhabitants to ransom themselves, to pay for their freedom. Men would pay 10 dinars, women 5, children won, those who could not pay would be enslaved. Balian negotiated on behalf of the poor, and Saladin agreed to release 7,000 of the poorest inhabitants without payment, funded by a lump sum from the city's treasury and from the Knights Hospitaller and Templar treasuries. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin's army entered Jerusalem. In stark contrast to the massacre that had accompanied the Crusader conquest 88 years earlier, there was no slaughter. Those who could pay the ransom were allowed to leave. Saladin released many captives beyond the agreed number, especially widows and orphans. Even some Christian chroniclers praised his mercy. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. The loss of the holy city was seen as a catastrophe and a divine judgment. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade. In response, 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs took the cross: Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II Augustus, King of France, and Richard I Lionheart, King of England. The Third Crusade, sometimes called the King's Crusade, saw an unprecedented level of royal involvement, but it was also marked by tragedy and frustration. Frederick Barbarossa, an old man in his 60s but still vigorous, led a large German army overland through the Byzantine Empire and into Anatolia. His march was largely successful, and he defeated Turkish forces in several battles. But on June 10, 1190, while crossing a river in Cilicia, Frederick drowned. The exact circumstances are unclear. He may have suffered a heart attack or simply been swept away by the current. His death was a devastating blow. Much of his army disintegrated, with many soldiers giving up and returning home. The French and English armies travelled by sea to the Holy Land. However, Richard and Philip were not friends. They were rivals, and their relationship was complicated by feudal politics. Richard, as Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, was technically Philip's vassal for those lands. Even though Richard was also a king, this underlying tension would affect the crusade. They arrived in the Levant in 1191 and joined the ongoing siege of Acre, a major port city that had been under siege by Crusader forces for nearly 2 years. The arrival of the king's armies, with fresh troops and resources, turned the tide. On July 12, 1191, Acre surrendered. The terms of surrender were negotiated with Saladin, who agreed to pay a ransom for the garrison and to release Christian prisoners. However, when Saladin delayed in meeting the terms, Richard, impatient and ruthless, ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners. This atrocity shocked both Christians and Muslims and remains a stain on Richard's reputation. After the fall of Acre, Philip declared that he had fulfilled his crusading vow and returned to France. His departure was seen by many as a betrayal, though Philip claimed ill health. Richard was now the dominant Christian leader in the Holy Land. Richard was a brilliant military commander, bold and decisive. He led his army south along the coast toward Jaffa, intending to use it as a base for an eventual assault on Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed his march, harassing the Crusaders with his cavalry. On September 7th, 1191, at Arsuf, Saladin committed his forces to a full battle. The Crusaders, marching in tight formation, withstood repeated charges. When Richard judged the moment right, he ordered a countercharge. The Hospitaller and Templar knights smashed into the Muslim lines, and Saladin's army broke and fled. The Battle of Arsuf was a significant victory for Richard, demonstrating that Saladin was not invincible. Richard continued south, securing coastal cities. He rebuilt the fortifications of Jaffa, preparing for the march on Jerusalem. But Jerusalem presented a daunting challenge. It was inland, in the hills, far from the coast and the Crusaders' supply lines. Saladin had strengthened its fortifications and poisoned the wells around it. Even if Richard could take the city, holding it would be nearly impossible with the forces he had. Richard marched toward Jerusalem twice, getting within sight of the city's walls. But each time, his advisors, particularly the military orders who had long experience in the region, convinced him that an assault would be folly. To take Jerusalem only to lose it again when Saladin counterattacked would be worse than not taking it at all. Meanwhile, in Europe, Richard's brother John was scheming to usurp his throne, and Philip of France was encroaching on Richard's French territories. Richard's attention and resources were divided. He needed to return home. In September of 1192, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The Crusader States would retain control of a narrow coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed free access to the holy sites. It was a pragmatic peace, a recognition of military realities, but it fell far short of the Crusades' goals. Richard left the Holy Land and began his journey home. His return trip became an adventure in itself. He was shipwrecked and then captured in Austria by Duke Leopold V, whom Richard had insulted during the Crusade. Richard was held captive and released only after a massive ransom was paid. He returned to England in 1194, having been gone for 4 years. Saladin did not long survive the Crusade. He died in March of 1193 in Damascus, having spent his fortune on campaigns and charity. He left behind a reputation as one of history's great commanders and a chivalrous enemy. His empire was divided among his relatives, and the unity he had imposed on the Muslim world began to fragment. Chapter 11: The Fourth Crusade and the Sack of Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, is one of the most infamous episodes in crusading history, for it never reached the Holy Land and instead resulted in the sacking of the Christian city of Constantinople. Pope Innocent III called for the crusade, envisioning an attack on Egypt, the power base of the Ayyubid dynasty, Saladin's successors. The crusade was to be led by powerful French and Italian nobles. The Crusaders contracted with Venice to provide ships to transport the army to Egypt. Venice was a wealthy maritime republic, and its ruler, the Doge Enrico Dandolo, was a shrewd, aged statesman, reportedly in his 90s and blind, or nearly so. The Venetians agreed to build a fleet and provide transport for 33,500 crusaders in exchange for 85,000 marks, an enormous sum. But when the Crusaders gathered in Venice in 1202, far fewer arrived than expected. Only about 12,000 Crusaders assembled, and they could not pay the full contracted amount. The Venetians refused to transport them until the debt was paid. The Crusaders, stranded and desperate, agreed to a proposal from Dandolo. They would help Venice recapture the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that had rebelled against Venetian rule. Pope Innocent, hearing of this plan, forbade it, threatening excommunication for any who attacked a Christian city. But the Crusaders, with no other options, proceeded. In November of 1202, they besieged and captured Zara. The Pope excommunicated the Crusaders, though he later lifted the sentence for all except the Venetians. While in Zara, the Crusaders received a proposal from Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince. Alexios's father, Isaac II, had been deposed and blinded by Alexios's uncle, who now ruled as Emperor Alexios III. Young Alexios promised that if the Crusaders helped him reclaim the throne, he would pay them 200,000 marks, provide troops for the crusade, and submit the Eastern Orthodox Church to Rome, healing the schism. It was an extraordinarily generous offer, probably too generous to be realistic. The crusading leaders debated. Many were uneasy about attacking another Christian city, especially Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom. But the promise of money to pay their debts and fund the crusade was tempting, and the Venetians, with old grievances against Byzantium, were eager. The crusade diverted to Constantinople. In July of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived outside Constantinople. The city's defences were formidable, but a portion of the fleet breached the harbour's chain boom and troops landed. The Varangian Guard, elite warriors serving the Byzantine Emperor, sallied out to fight, but were driven back. Emperor Alexios III, fearing a coup or defeat, fled the city, taking the imperial treasury with him. The Byzantine nobility restored Isaac II and crowned his son, Alexios IV, as co-emperor. But Alexios IV could not fulfill his promises. The Byzantine treasury was empty, and the population of Constantinople was hostile to the Latins, as they called the Western Europeans. Riots broke out. In February of 1204, a Byzantine noble, Alexios Doukas, seized power in a coup, imprisoning Alexios IV and Isaac, both of whom died shortly after, probably murdered. The Crusaders, denied payment and now facing a hostile government, decided to take Constantinople by force. They would conquer the city, install their own emperor, and divide the Byzantine Empire's wealth. On April 9th, 1204, the Crusaders launched an all-out assault on Constantinople's sea walls. It was a desperate, violent affair, but the Crusaders broke through. For 3 days they sacked the city. The sack of Constantinople was one of the great atrocities of the Middle Ages. The Crusaders looted churches, monasteries, and palaces. They destroyed priceless works of art and ancient manuscripts. They desecrated holy sites, including the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. Women were raped, civilians were killed. The Byzantine chronicler Nicetas Choniates wrote that even the Saracens were more merciful. The Crusaders melted down golden icons, divided jewels and relics, and shipped treasures back to Europe. Venice received the famous bronze horses that now adorn Street, Mark's Basilica, as well as countless other artworks. The Fourth Crusade's leaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, electing Baldwin of Flanders as emperor. The Byzantine Empire fractured into several smaller states, with Byzantine nobles establishing rival courts in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. Instead, it shattered the Byzantine Empire, deepened the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, and weakened Christendom at a time when unity was desperately needed against external threats. The Byzantine Empire would eventually be restored in 1261, but it never recovered its former strength. Some historians argue that the Fourth Crusade contributed to Byzantium's eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Chapter 12. The Children's Crusade and Other Movements. In the early 13th century, crusading fervour remained strong in Europe, but it was increasingly mixed with disillusionment. The Fourth Crusade's diversion to Constantinople had scandalized many. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Yet the ideal of crusading, the promise of spiritual rewards, and the romance of holy war continued to inspire. One of the strangest episodes of this period is known as the Children's Crusade of 1212, although modern historians debate whether it was truly composed of children, or whether the term referred to young, poor, or socially marginalized people. The sources are fragmentary and often confused, mixing legend with fact. Two movements occurred, one in France and one in Germany. In France, a young shepherd or peasant boy named Stephen claimed to have received a vision from Jesus, commanding him to lead a crusade. Stephen gathered a following, and they marched to Paris, where Stephen sought an audience with King Philip II Augustus. The king, unimpressed, told Stephen and his followers to go home. Most did, but some continued to the Mediterranean coast, hoping to cross to the Holy Land. Ships were provided by merchants, but rather than transporting the would-be crusaders to the Holy Land, the merchants sold them into slavery in North Africa. In Germany, a boy named Nicholas led a similar movement. Thousands, mostly young people, followed him over the Alps into Italy. Many died from hunger and hardship along the way. Those who reached the port of Genoa expected the sea to part for them, allowing them to walk to the Holy Land. When this did not happen, the movement collapsed. Some participants continued to Rome, where Pope Innocent III supposedly released them from their vows. Others simply went home. The Children's Crusade, whether literally children or not, reflects the desperation and fervour of the period, as well as the recurring theme of non-noble, popular crusading movements that ended in tragedy. Chapter 13. The Fifth Crusade. Pope Innocent III continued to call for crusades. He was one of the most powerful popes in history, asserting papal authority over kings and emperors, and he saw crusading as central to the Church's mission. Before his death in 1216, he organized what became known as the Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217. This crusade targeted Egypt, following the strategy that had been intended for the Fourth Crusade. Egypt was wealthy and was the base of the Ayyubid dynasty. Controlling Egypt would, in theory, give the Crusaders leverage to reclaim Jerusalem. A large force, including contingents from Germany, Italy, and other regions, gathered and sailed to Egypt. They laid siege to the city of Damietta, a key port on the Nile Delta, in May of 1218. The siege dragged on for over a year, marked by disease, hardship, and the death of many crusaders. In November of 1219, Damietta finally fell to the Crusaders. The crusading army now debated what to do next. The leadership was complicated. The nominal military leader was John of Brienne, the King of Jerusalem, but real authority was contested by various nobles and by the papal legate Cardinal Pelagius, who claimed to represent the Pope's authority and often clashed with John. Sultan al-Kamil, the Ayyubid ruler of Egypt and Saladin's nephew, offered generous terms. He would return Jerusalem and much of the former Crusader territories in exchange for the Crusaders leaving Egypt. Many Crusaders favoured accepting this offer, but Cardinal Pelagius refused, insisting on total victory. In 1221, the Crusader army marched from Damietta toward Cairo. It was a disaster. The Nile flooded, cutting off their supply lines. The Egyptians opened sluice gates, intentionally flooding the land and trapping the Crusader army. Surrounded, starving, and facing annihilation, the Crusaders were forced to surrender. The terms were humiliating. They had to evacuate Egypt entirely, returning Damietta and receiving nothing in return. The Fifth Crusade ended in complete failure. Chapter 14. Frederick II and the Sixth Crusade. The Sixth Crusade is unique in crusading history because it was led by an excommunicated emperor and succeeded through diplomacy rather than warfare. The emperor was Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, King of Germany, King of Sicily, and Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick was one of the most remarkable figures of the Middle Ages, intelligent, cultured, fluent in 6 languages including Arabic, and skeptical of religious orthodoxy. He had taken a crusading vow in 1215, but repeatedly delayed his departure, angering Pope Honorius III and later Pope Gregory IX. In 1227, Frederick finally set out, but turned back after a few days, claiming illness. Pope Gregory, out of patience, excommunicated him. In 1228, Frederick sailed for the Holy Land anyway, an excommunicated crusader. His presence was awkward. The military orders initially refused to cooperate with him. But Frederick was not interested in fighting. He had cultivated a relationship with Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt through correspondence. The two leaders engaged in negotiations, and in February of 1229 they signed the Treaty of Jaffa. Under the treaty, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor to the coast were ceded to the Crusaders for 10 years. It was achieved without a battle. Frederick crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a strange ceremony attended by few because of his excommunicated status. However, the treaty was controversial. The Temple Mount, sacred to Muslims as the site of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, remained under Muslim control, with Crusaders allowed only to visit. Many Crusaders felt this was inadequate, that the holy sites should be fully in Christian hands. The military orders and the church criticised Frederick. Moreover, the treaty was for only 10 years, and it depended on Al-Kamil's goodwill. Frederick returned to Italy shortly after, having spent only a few months in the Holy Land. The Pope, rather than celebrating the recovery of Jerusalem, remained hostile to Frederick, and a complex political struggle ensued. Nonetheless, Jerusalem was briefly back in Christian hands, an achievement no crusading army had managed since 1187. When the 10-year truce expired, Jerusalem was recaptured by Muslim forces in 1244. It would never again be under Christian control during the crusading period. Chapter 15. The Seventh Crusade and Louis IX. King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, was one of the most pious rulers of the Middle Ages. Deeply religious, he saw crusading as a sacred duty. In the early 1240s, Louis fell seriously ill. He vowed that if he recovered, he would take the cross. He recovered, and in 1248 he and his army sailed for Egypt, following the strategy of attacking the Ayyubids' power base. The Seventh Crusade initially succeeded. In June of 1249, the Crusaders captured Damietta after a brief siege. But then, Louis decided to wait through the summer and autumn, allowing the Nile's flood season to pass before advancing on Cairo. This delay gave the Ayyubids time to prepare. In late 1249, the Crusader army marched south toward Cairo. They reached the town of al-Mansura, where an Egyptian army blocked their path. In February of 1250, the Crusaders attempted to cross a canal and attack the Egyptian camp. Louis's brother, Robert of Artois, led a cavalry charge that broke into al-Mansura, but then pursued too far and was surrounded. Robert and most of his knights were killed. The Crusader army became bogged down in fighting around al-Mansura, suffering heavy casualties. Supplies ran short. Disease, probably dysentery, ravaged the camp. In April, Louis ordered a retreat back to Damietta, but the Egyptian forces pursued and attacked. The Crusader army disintegrated. Louis himself was captured, along with thousands of his soldiers. Louis's capture was a catastrophe. He was held for ransom. The Egyptians demanded Damietta and a payment of 800,000 bezants, an enormous sum. Louis's wife, Queen Margaret, negotiated from Damietta and arranged for the ransom to be paid. Louis was released in May of 1250, after which he and the surviving Crusaders left Egypt. But Louis did not return to France. Instead, he travelled to the Crusader States and spent 4 years there, from 1250 to 1254, working to strengthen their defences. He rebuilt fortifications, mediated disputes among the nobility, and provided financial support. His presence and resources helped stabilize the Crusader States during a difficult period. Louis returned to France in 1254, but he never forgot his vow. In the late 1260s, despite being in his 50s and in declining health, Louis organized another crusade, the Eighth Crusade. This time, the target was Tunis in North Africa. Louis's advisors suggested that the Emir of Tunis might be convinced to convert to Christianity and ally with the Crusaders. It was a dubious plan. The crusade departed in 1270. The army landed near Tunis in July and established a camp to besiege the city. But conditions were terrible. It was high summer and disease broke out almost immediately. Louis himself fell ill, likely with dysentery, and died on August 25th, 1270. His death effectively ended the crusade. The army negotiated a treaty with Tunis and returned to Europe. Louis's body was returned to France, where he was buried at Saint-Denis and later canonized. Chapter 16. The Mamluk Sultanate and the Fall of the Crusader States. While the Crusaders struggled, the political landscape of the Muslim Middle East was transformed by the rise of the Mamluks. The Mamluks were originally slave soldiers, mostly Turkic and Circassian, who had been purchased and trained by the Ayyubid sultans. In 1250, during the chaos of the Seventh Crusade and shortly after Louis IX's capture, the Mamluks in Egypt revolted, killing the Sultan and seizing power. They established the Mamluk Sultanate, which would rule Egypt and Syria for over 2.5 centuries. The Mamluks were formidable warriors and effective administrators. They were also hostile to the Crusader States, viewing them as threats and as targets for jihad. a series of capable sultans, starting with Baibars, launched campaigns to systematically conquer the remaining Crusader territories. Baibars, who ruled from 1260 to 1277, was a brilliant and ruthless military commander. He captured numerous Crusader fortresses, including the great castle of Crac des Chevaliers in 1271. He was also a diplomat, maintaining alliances with other Muslim powers and even with the Mongols at times. Under Baibars, the Crusader states were pushed back to a few coastal strongholds. The Mongols, who had exploded out of Central Asia in the early 13th century, also played a role in this period. In 1260, a Mongol army invaded Syria and captured Damascus and Aleppo. The Crusader states hoped the Mongols might be allies against the Muslims, especially after hearing rumours, mostly false, that some Mongol leaders were Christian. But the Mamluks defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, stopping the Mongol advance. The Mongols withdrew from Syria, and the Mamluks became the dominant power. By the late 1300s, the Crusader states were reduced to a few cities clinging to the coast: Acre, Tyre, Sidon, and a handful of castles. They were isolated, cut off from their hinterlands, dependent on supplies from Europe and on the military orders for defence. Yet they held on for decades, sustained by the ongoing, if diminishing, arrival of crusaders from Europe and by the wealth from trade. In 1289, Sultan Qalawun, Baibars' successor, decided to finish the Crusader presence. He marched on Acre, the capital of the remnant kingdom of Jerusalem. Acre was heavily fortified and defended by the military orders and by a garrison of knights from Europe. But Qalawun died before the siege could begin, and his son, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, took up the task. The siege of Acre began in April of 1291. The Mamluks brought a massive army, perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 strong, along with numerous siege engines. The defenders numbered only about 15,000, including knights, soldiers, and armed civilians. For 6 weeks, the Mamluks pounded the walls with catapults and undermined them with tunnels. On May 18th, the Mamluks launched a final assault. They breached the walls in multiple places. The defenders fought desperately, but the city fell. The streets became scenes of slaughter. Thousands were killed, thousands more were enslaved. The Grand Master of the Templars and the Marshal of the Hospitallers died fighting. Some defenders and civilians escaped by sea, fleeing to Cyprus. Within days, the remaining Crusader cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, were evacuated. The military orders demolished their castles rather than let them fall into Mamluk hands. By the end of 1291, the Crusader presence on the mainland of the Levant was over. The Kingdom of Jerusalem ceased to exist as a territorial entity, though its titular kingship continued to be claimed by various European rulers for centuries. The military orders relocated their headquarters to Cyprus. The crusading movement would continue, but never again would there be a sustained Christian presence in the Holy Land. Chapter 17. Later Crusades and the decline of the crusading ideal. Even after the fall of Acre, popes and kings continued to call for crusades to reclaim the Holy Land, though these efforts were increasingly half-hearted and unsuccessful. The ideal of crusading persisted, but the practical realities made success unlikely. Europe was embroiled in its own conflicts. the 100 Years' War between England and France, the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire, and the rise of powerful, centralized monarchies that were more interested in their own territories than in distant adventures. The military orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, had been central to the defense of the Crusader States. With the loss of the Holy Land, their role became unclear. The Hospitallers relocated to Rhodes, an island in the Aegean, and established a new base there, continuing to fight Muslim powers and engaging in piracy. They would later move to Malta, where they became known as the Knights of Malta, and they continue to exist today as a sovereign entity and a charitable organization. The Templars, however, faced a darker fate. They had become wealthy and powerful, owning extensive properties across Europe and acting as bankers to kings and popes. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars and coveting their wealth, orchestrated their downfall. In 1307, on Friday, October 13th, Philip ordered the arrest of all Templars in France. They were accused of heresy, idol worship, and various other crimes. Under torture, many confessed to the charges. In 1312, Pope Clement V, under pressure from Philip, disbanded the Templar order. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. The Templars' properties were transferred to the Hospitallers or seized by the crown, though much of their wealth disappeared, fueling legends of hidden Templar treasure. Crusading efforts continued to be directed at other targets. In the Baltic region, the Teutonic Knights, another military order, conducted crusades against the pagan peoples of Prussia and Lithuania throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. These Baltic crusades were marked by brutality and led to the forced conversion and subjugation of the native populations. In Spain, the Reconquista, the Christian effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was often framed as a crusade. By the 13th century, most of Spain had been reconquered, with only the Emirate of Granada remaining under Muslim control in the south. Granada would hold out until 1492, when it fell to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, completing the Reconquista. The Reconquista had a very different character from the Eastern Crusades, as Christians, Muslims, and Jews had coexisted in Spain for centuries, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in cooperation. The fall of Granada and the subsequent expulsion of Jews and Muslims marked a tragic end to this period of pluralism. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottoman Turks emerged as the new great Muslim power. Originating as a small principality in northwestern Anatolia, the Ottomans expanded rapidly, conquering Byzantine territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. In 1354, they crossed into Europe, and by the end of the 14th century, they had reduced the Byzantine Empire to little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered holdings. Popes called for crusades against the Ottomans, but these were largely ineffective. A major crusading effort was made in 1396, when a combined army of French, Hungarian, and other forces marched into the Balkans to confront the Ottomans. At the Battle of Nicopolis, the Crusaders were decisively defeated by Sultan Bayezid I. It was one of the last major crusades in the traditional sense. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI led a desperate defence, but the city was vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The Ottomans used massive cannons to breach the ancient walls. On May 29th, 1453, Constantinople fell. Constantine died fighting on the walls. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, which had endured for over 1,000 years. It sent shockwaves through Christian Europe and is often seen as marking the end of the Middle Ages. By the 15th century, the crusading ideal had changed. The religious fervour that had driven the First Crusade had diminished. Crusades were increasingly political tools, used by popes to fight heretics, rival Christian rulers, or to raise money through indulgences. The corruption of the indulgence system, where remission of sins could be bought, would become one of the sparks for the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century. Chapter 18. The impact of the Crusades on Europe. The Crusades had profound and lasting impacts on European society, economy, culture, and politics. These effects were multifaceted, some beneficial, others deeply harmful. Economically, the Crusades stimulated trade between Europe and the East. Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, grew wealthy from transporting crusaders and goods and from trading with the Levant. The increased flow of goods, including spices, silk, and other luxuries, helped integrate Europe into a broader Mediterranean and global economy. This economic expansion contributed to the growth of towns and a more money-based economy, weakening the feudal system. Culturally, the Crusades brought Europeans into contact with the more advanced civilizations of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Crusaders encountered new ideas, technologies, and knowledge. They brought back Arabic translations of ancient Greek philosophical and scientific texts, which had been lost in the West. These texts, translated into Latin, would fuel the intellectual renaissance of the 12th and 13th centuries, contributing to the development of universities and scholasticism. The Crusades also influenced European military technology and tactics. Crusaders learned from Byzantine and Muslim fortification techniques, leading to advances in castle design. They encountered new weapons and strategies. The experience of organizing and supplying large armies over long distances contributed to the development of more sophisticated military logistics. However, the Crusades also deepened hostilities and fostered lasting prejudices. The violence against Jews during the Crusades, starting with the massacres in the Rhineland during the First Crusade and recurring in later Crusades, intensified anti-Semitism in Europe. Jewish communities were increasingly marginalized, subjected to legal restrictions, and periodically expelled from various regions. The Crusades contributed to a climate of intolerance that would have tragic consequences for centuries. Relations between Eastern and Western Christianity, already strained by the Great Schism of 1054, were further damaged by the Crusades, especially by the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. The Orthodox East came to view the Catholic West as brutal and untrustworthy. This mutual hostility persists in some forms to this day. The Crusades also contributed to the development of a more centralized and powerful papacy. Popes used their authority to call crusades, to grant spiritual rewards, and to levy taxes on the church to fund crusading efforts. This increased papal power, but also led to criticism and resentment, as the church was seen as increasingly involved in worldly politics and warfare. Politically, the Crusades had varied effects on European kingdoms. crusading could enhance a king's prestige, but it was also enormously expensive and could weaken a kingdom if the king was absent for years. Some rulers, like Richard the Lionheart, became legendary figures due to their crusading exploits, while others faced rebellion and political instability at home. Chapter 19. The impact of the Crusades on the Islamic world. For the Islamic world, the Crusades were a traumatic but ultimately galvanizing experience. The initial crusading victories shocked Muslim rulers, who had not anticipated such a large-scale and aggressive response from Christian Europe. The loss of Jerusalem, in particular, was a profound blow, as the city is the third holiest site in Islam, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. The Crusades led to a resurgence of jihad ideology. Muslim scholars and leaders increasingly framed resistance to the Crusaders as a religious duty. This helped unify disparate Muslim factions, at least temporarily. Figures like Nur ad-Din and Saladin became celebrated as heroes of the faith, and their legacies influenced later generations of Muslim leaders. However, the Crusades also exposed and in some ways exacerbated divisions within the Islamic world. The Sunni-Shia divide remained significant, with the Fatimid Caliphate and the Sunni powers often more concerned with fighting each other than with uniting against the Crusaders. The fragmentation of the Islamic world into different caliphates, sultanates, and emirates meant that coordinated responses to the Crusaders were difficult. Economically, the Crusades disrupted trade routes but also created new opportunities. Muslim merchants continued to trade with the Crusader States and with Italian merchants, and the demand for Eastern goods in Europe increased. Cities like Damascus and Cairo remained major economic centers. Culturally, the Crusades had less immediate impact on the Islamic world than on Europe. Islamic civilization during this period was already highly developed, with advanced scholarship in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Muslims were generally not as interested in European culture as Europeans were in Islamic culture. Nevertheless, there were exchanges. Some Muslim scholars studied European military tactics and technology. The long-term legacy of the Crusades in the Islamic world is complex. For centuries, the Crusades were not a central focus of Islamic historical memory. Other events, such as the Mongol invasions, which destroyed Baghdad and killed the Caliph in 1258, were seen as more traumatic. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries, during the colonial period and the Arab-Israeli conflict, that the Crusades were rediscovered and reinterpreted as a symbol of Western aggression against the Islamic world. This reinterpretation has had significant political implications. Chapter 20. The Legacy of the Crusades. The Crusades ended over 700 years ago, yet their legacy remains contentious and influential. In the West, the Crusades have been romanticized, vilified, and endlessly reinterpreted. During the age of imperialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries, European powers sometimes invoked crusading imagery to justify colonial conquests, portraying themselves as bringing civilization and Christianity to benighted regions. This rhetoric caused deep resentment in colonized lands. In modern times, the term crusade is used metaphorically to describe any vigorous campaign for a cause, from a crusade against poverty to a crusade for justice. Yet, This usage can be problematic, especially in interfaith contexts, given the historical violence and religious warfare associated with the actual Crusades. In the Islamic world, as mentioned, the Crusades have been reinterpreted as a precursor to modern Western imperialism and intervention in the Middle East. Political and militant groups have invoked crusading imagery to rally support, framing contemporary conflicts as continuations of the medieval struggle. This has contributed to a narrative of civilizational conflict between the Christian West and the Muslim East, a narrative that many scholars argue is overly simplistic and historically inaccurate. Historians continue to debate the Crusades' significance and legacy. Some argue that the Crusades were a defensive response to Islamic expansion, pointing out that Muslim armies had conquered Christian territories in the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain in the centuries before the Crusades. Others emphasized the aggressive, imperialistic nature of the crusading movement and its devastating impact on the peoples of the Levant, including not only Muslims and Jews, but also Eastern Christians. What is clear is that the Crusades were a complex phenomenon involving religious devotion, political ambition, economic interests, and personal motivations. They were not simply a clash of civilizations, but involved alliances and conflicts that cut across religious and ethnic lines. Christian and Muslim rulers sometimes allied with each other against common enemies. Trade and cultural exchange continued even during periods of warfare. The Crusades also remind us of the dangers of religious fanaticism and of using religion to justify violence. The atrocities committed during the Crusades by both Christians and Muslims stand as a testament to the human capacity for cruelty when convinced of righteousness. Yet the Crusades also produced examples of nobility, courage, and honor, figures like Saladin, who were respected even by their enemies. Understanding the Crusades requires us to avoid both romanticizing and demonizing them. They were a product of their time, shaped by medieval beliefs, social structures, and political realities that are very different from our own. Yet they continue to resonate because they touch on enduring themes: faith and doubt, war and peace, tolerance and intolerance, the allure of distant lands, and the yearning for something greater than oneself. And so we reach the end of our journey through the history of the Crusades, from the dusty fields of Clermont to the fall of Acre, from the fervour of the First Crusade to the final flickering of the crusading ideal. We have travelled through 2 centuries of conflict, ambition, faith, and tragedy. We have seen kingdoms rise and fall, cities besieged and sacked, armies marching across deserts and mountains. The Crusades were many things: a holy war, a pilgrimage, a land grab, an adventure, a tragedy. They involved popes and peasants, kings and knights, merchants and monks, Muslims and Christians and Jews. They shaped the medieval world and left legacies that still echo today. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you might reflect on the strangeness of history, how events from so long ago can still feel relevant, how the choices made by people who lived centuries before us can ripple forward through time, shaping the world we inhabit. The Crusaders believed they were doing God's work, fulfilling a sacred mission. Whether they succeeded or failed, whether their cause was just or unjust, is for each of us to consider. Thank you for joining me on this long, winding journey through the Crusades. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may the lessons of history guide us toward a more understanding and compassionate world. This has been Sleepless History. Until next time, good night.